Okay, there we go. All right, let's get things underway. We are once again very happy to welcome Chris Gerboth with us today to discuss his book, Frank Meade. Chris, before we get into the book, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? What do you do? Where are you from? All of that good stuff. Oh, hang on a second, Chris, you're muted.
Yep, I was muted.
There we go.
Yeah, so I was raised in Colorado, a small town in southeastern Colorado called Rocky Ford, and it actually sort of provides a setting for the novel. And grew up there, went to school, spent the first half of my career actually living in Denver, then moved to Wisconsin. I guess it'll be 9 years ago. Or is it 10 years ago, Sarah? I don't know. It's getting pretty close. And now I live in Wausau. So,
all right.
My day job is I work for United Healthcare. And so most of my days are spent writing training. And so, but I've been writing and doing other creative endeavors on the side for a long time now.
Great. And so this is your first novel?
It's actually my second one.
Okay.
My first one was 9 or 10 years ago. It's sort of the opposite of Frank Meade. It's a darker and more sinister novel. This one is all about optimism and fun. So
yeah. And how did this one come about? What are the origins? Where did the idea come from? Is it something that you've been working on for a while?
The thought has been in my head for quite a while. The setting of the book is in the early 90s in Colorado. And in fact, it was in early 90s in Colorado that sort of the ideas of the plot first started coming together for me. And I kind of tinkered away at it, then set it aside until last year. I decided I had enough life experience, enough things to say that I was ready to put it together.
Nice, nice. And for those who haven't read it yet, just kind of give you a brief summary. Frank Meade is a Marxist rock star and actor whose career and star has faded by the time he returns to his hometown in Colorado. And that homecoming is just the first of a series of events that kind of shake things up around that small town, which is Oxford. And that is, I assume, a fictional town?
Yeah, it is a fictional town. However, it's an early name for a town that was 2 towns over from me. I had literally a place where they crossed the river with oxen, so it's Oxford. So,
gotcha.
But I kind of resurrected the name because I don't know, it has a little bit of irony to it. So.
And so tell us about Frank Meade himself, how you developed the character, why make him a Marxist, why make him a rock star? Can you tell us about developing the character?
Yeah. Frank Meade is actually based on a real person, not anyone I knew, but someone I knew of. And the real life model for Frank Meade was a guy named Dean Reed. And Dean Reed grew up in Colorado, became a Marxist out in LA, moved to Europe, and actually ended up becoming a rock star, movie star in East Germany. And he was literally known as the Red Elvis. Behind the Iron Curtain. And the true story of Dean Reed is that he actually ended up dying right before the Berlin Wall came down. And some people will say under mysterious circumstances. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories that he might have, become disillusioned with Stalinism or whatever. And so he, at any rate, um, so he never made it back to the United States. The book sort of takes the alternative of, what if someone like him had lived and then come back to their hometown?
Hmm.
And they've obviously, changed, but their hometown hasn't. And so where would that sort of natural conflict and lead to both comedy and tragedy, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that small town setting has in the book has been in decline for quite some time before Frank shows up, and a lot of the folks around Oxford just kind of, as you mentioned to me before, have a sense of just apathy, and that leads to kind of some social rot.
Yeah, so I think the story of Oxford or any small town under, I don't know if you want to pick a number, under 5,000, under 3,000, 2,000, whatever it is, all around the country, a lot of small towns are in serious decline. That rural poverty is really replacing urban poverty as one of our biggest um, social ills. And I, I obviously growing up in that town, I began to feel it um, as I sort of watched, the town get smaller and smaller. My high school, I think when I started in school was 600 students, and it was down to 450 by the time I graduated. And so a small town is kind of big drop. Um, and it isn't that, people uh, aren't wonderful. It isn't that people don't want to create a great life for themselves and everything else. Just the tax basis of those small towns gets wiped out. And
Yeah.
so um, what we're seeing, and it's only accelerated, is that little cities like that struggle to provide even basic services, keep the lights on, keep the water running, the sewers functioning and things like that. Um, and 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 the the most common expression of that then becomes sort of an apathy. It's like things aren't as good as they used to be. Shrug our shoulders and keep moving on. So
Sure.
yeah.
But then, and I know exactly what you're talking about. I come from a small town in Michigan that was well under, pretty, a bit under 5,000. So I know what you're saying, and I go back to that town often. But in the book, you mentioned your other one is your other novel is more sinister, and he tried to bring a bit more optimism with this one. And so, in that small town, and in the face of that apathy, it takes someone like Frank Meade, an outsider, basically, even though it's his hometown. By the time he comes back, some may consider him an outsider, but it takes someone like Frank to kind of shake things up a little bit in the book.
Yeah,
Right.
he's definitely the catalyst, but in the book, there's actually an outsider and an insider who team up to make things work. So Frank is coming in, and his character development sort of follows the hero's journey. He comes in, and the plot of the book is almost as soon as he arrives, he learns that there are bad people trying to sell off the water rights of the town. And to really understand, anything about living in the West, you have to understand about water first of all. The fact is that you take water away from the land and it goes fallow. There's nothing else to do with it. There's not enough rainfall in the West to grow crops or maintain any kind of agricultural economy. So that's really where the bad guys come in. They're trying to sell their water rights for a premium price and get very, very, very wealthy in the process. So Frank comes back, and he's obviously a catalyst, but then the other character is Drew, who's his childhood friend. And Drew has been the editor of the daily paper his entire adult life, and he's like Frank, he's middle-aged, and he's kind of just gone along to get along.
Sure.
Until he realizes, like everyone else does, that there's no getting along. Once the water's gone, that's it, game over. And so Drew has a lot of growth that he needs to do. Number one, he's a gay man in a small town. And so there's a whole part of his character development, which is coming to terms with the fact that he's been able to really submerge the full expression of himself for years and years and years and years, because in small towns, nobody ever talks about, who's this, who's that, because, they want to be able to run into each other at the grocery store and not have any, uncomfortable conversations, or so they would see it. And so there's Frank's journey, which I think really develops into a rich character, but then there's also Drew's journey, and he really finds himself and finds his voice. And the funny thing is, of the two characters, I'm more Drew than Frank. I've always sort of attracted around me sort of these alpha personalities who are a little bit wacky, and other people might find even a little bit annoying, but I sort of glom onto because I find them interesting. And I'm sort of the cool, steady one, kind of always just sort of plodding around along in the background. So
Interesting. And so in terms of, and you had mentioned this to me before, I mean, it's not a short book, but it's not War and Peace either in terms of its length.
no, it's 57,000 words.
Okay.
So technically it's short of a novel.
Gotcha.
It's
Yeah.
almost a novella.
Right. So that's tricky then when you don't have a lot of pages to work with to really develop the characters in a rich way, and give them some heft and some weight.
Well,
Was
yeah, to a certain extent, that's a challenge for any writer. I think the biggest challenge for any writer is having something to say and somewhere to go with the character. I think you can use intensity of experience as opposed to longevity of experience in a character's arc in order to develop that. And in a lot of ways, that's what I set out to do. I wanted to keep the writing very crisp, keep the pages turning, and so there's not a lot of. There are only a couple places you'll find in the book where there's a sort of internal dialogue about where the big epiphany occurs. There's a few little spots here and there, but for the most part, it's plot driven. It's personality driven. It's very conversation driven, in the way that it's presented. And
and before we continue more with conversation about it, about creating it and that sort of thing, would you maybe have a passage in mind that you wouldn't mind sharing to kind of give us a little taste before we?
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought maybe I could read the first meeting of Frank and Drew after so many years not speaking to each other, seeing each other. And Frank Meade has been living in Italy, and he is really a washed up spaghetti Western star. So when he was, if any of you are familiar with spaghetti Westerns, I just love them. So Once Upon a Time in the West, all the Clint Eastwood films, the trilogy of Sergio Leone.
Yes.
And so that's where he basically, staked out the latter part of his career. And then he's just been sort of living on the cheap in Italy ever since. And so he's come back, and first thing he does is he calls his friend Drew and says, basically, I need you to pick me up at the airport. And the only problem with that is that the airport is 3 hours away from Oxford. So, and it's sort of about, and Drew thinks, classic Frank, just call me out of the blue and, hey, come pick me up at the airport, will you? So Drew goes to pick him up, and this picks up where he walks in and finds Frank. Eurotrash cowboy. The first words that popped into Drew's mind seeing his friend Frank Meade crashed out in the main terminal. His 6'2" lanky frame was contorted over the armrests of 3 stationary waiting chairs. He looked hopelessly uncomfortable in his skinny jeans and red silk cowboy shirt. A well-worn straw cowboy hat covered his face. Even from several feet away, Drew could hear him breathing heavily underneath. At 10 p.m., the terminal was empty, save for Drew, Frank, and a husky janitor manhandling a floor buffer in the far corner. Drew made his way over. Yo, Frank, he said, lightly kicking the chair of the cradling singer's midsection. Frank barely stirred and let out a light groan. Frank! Drew tried a little louder a second time. Frank shifted and tried to wave Drew away. Drew lifted Frank's hat to see his face. It was Frank Meade, all right. He had the same chiseled features and flowing brown hair, though with a little more gray that made him a spaghetti western star. And he was gassed. Frank twisted his body toward Drew, and a stainless steel flask fell onto the floor, striking the polished granite and echoing across the terminal.
I'll mute myself right now. Cool. All right. So the connection to spaghetti westerns and Italy makes me think of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, movie that the Tarantino movie that came out not too long ago. Is that coincidence or intentional, or am I way off there? Is there any?
I don't know. I mean, Tarantino takes these kind of to an extreme. I don't think, it could be that, that influenced me to a certain degree. But I spent every Sunday growing up watching the Sergio Leone films,
Yeah.
They're all dubbed into English and sounded funny and had cool music and everything going on. And actually, as sort of background for this book, as a writer, you always write other things that help you in your character development. I actually wrote a scene, this opening scene of one of Frank Meade's movies, and I considered including it in the book, but maybe that'll be a separate project later on. But it's a sort of classic thing of walking into a bar and everybody gets shot, and they toss a silver dollar on the bar and then walk out, and then there's a nice little Spanish guitar, following them as they go.
Can you talk to us a bit about kind of getting back to the process of creating the book, editing? How many drafts did you go through? We should note the publisher is Eclectic River Daydream. That's a publisher I'm not familiar with, but did you work with someone there? What was the creation?
No, I am Eclectic River Daydream. That's
gotcha.
That's my company. So yeah,
cool.
I did work with someone there actually. So and the guy's an asshole too.
Well, but then you have complete artistic control over it.
That's right. That's right.
That's awesome.
Like I say, I chipped away on the story probably about 9 or 10 years ago, and then pulled it back up again. And I don't know how many drafts I went through. It was draft after draft after draft, and I kept setting it next to the couch so my wife Sarah could proofread it. And I just nudge it a little bit close to the couch, to take a look at this, and so she she did the first major proofread on it. I have a couple of friends in one in Colorado, one in Washington also
Okay.
read it. My friend Lynn, who's a master teacher in Colorado, actually um, was a huge help. Um, and the other thing that I did, which was really interesting, and just sort of I didn't realize people did it, but I think some people do, is I recruited some beta readers.
Hmm.
So I got in the book to the point where I could sort of put it in book form, and I ran off proofs of it. And in fact, Matt Stifler, who's on here with us, was one of my beta readers, and um, that was a huge help. Um, I gave them all 3 weeks to read it. They took a survey. They at least let me know I was in the right direction. And once I had that done, then I felt pretty good that I had something that was gonna stick. Um, Up to
Nice.
that point, you never really know, but and there are other sort of things that I did with that. I made a point of not asking any of the beta readers if personally if they liked it.
Hmm.
So they responded anonymously to the survey, but I really think it was sometimes you'll read a book and it's not your cup of tea, but you can still say it's a good book. And
Mhm.
so um, yeah, that part of it was really neat. And if I do another book in the future, I'm definitely going to go through the same process. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm always curious um, at what point authors decide the book is done, or at least ready. Maybe it's never done, but at least it's ready to put out there to the public.
Uh, it is. I mean, there is a point that it's done, and maybe it's the point at which the author is done. Um, but there is a definite crossover point. Um, and if you're not feeling pretty confident about that, then you're not ready. You need to keep going in there, and whatever it is that's bothering you, it might just be a clumsy paragraph. There are ones I went back to and like, just really cannot get this down. And so that was kind of, once I had checked all those boxes, I was, I knew because I was reading really well, and I knew that it felt right to send out to the world.
Good. That's cool. Getting back to the plot and this whole issue of water and selling water and scarcity of water, being from Colorado, I would imagine that you still obviously pay attention to a lot of stuff that's going on there and across the West. And certainly, I mean, that's a monumental issue, not just in the Western US, but all over the world. But in terms of this setting, did you go back and do some research or talk to some people, or are you just from following it just already well aware of everything that's going on over water issues in the West? Did you
Uh,
have to do a little more research to try and get it as close to where you wanted it to be, as far as whether it's an accurate depiction? Did you even strive for, there has to be some accuracy to make it believable,
yeah.
but
No, earlier in my career, I learned a lot about water uh, in Colorado, in part because I have a master's degree in history, and so I researched a whole lot about water, and over the course of time, water law works in Colorado. And it's not just among individuals or corporations or cities or whatever, but there are multi-state compacts that govern how water is allocated in the West. And of course, that's what we're seeing right now, especially with the Colorado River Basin. For the first time, there's been declared a water shortage in the Colorado River Basin that kicks in all kinds of legal remedies, including taking a lot of agriculture in places like Arizona out of commission. So I just, I can't emphasize enough, sort of critical nature of water in the whole way the West is, developed and continues to find itself. In Northern California, where my aunt lives, she lives in Chico, rice farmers are, instead of using the water to grow rice, and you know what you have to do to grow rice, you basically flood a field and then you sit there and you watch it evaporate for 3 months. They're taking their water and they're selling it downstate to Los Angeles and other places south in the Imperial Valley, because the water itself is worth more than the rice they could grow with it. And for those of us living in the Midwest, where we're surrounded by lakes and rivers, streams, and everything else, that's a foreign concept. There's water everywhere around here, and nobody thinks about, well, who owns it? Well, it's sort of owned by everyone, right? Well, no, it's not. Out west, it's all spoken for. Even the rain that comes off of your roof belongs to somebody out west. Rain barrels are technically illegal because
Really?
that watershed, that water is part of the watershed. So
Oh, because they need it
yeah,
to
yeah,
basically
it's
soak
going
it
to
in,
find its way to a stream or a river,
back
to
into
a
the
canal, to
aquifers. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
And no, I don't think there are rain barrel police
Sure.
running around and shooting holes in people's rain barrels or something. That'd be kind of funny. But
Yeah, it would. But I mean, you're right though. Living here in the Midwest, it's just not something. It's that it's a foreign concept to us, and I mean, it's a great thing that we have the Great Lakes Compact in place and working um, with Canada on that. But
mhm.
I don't. I think it's going to come sooner, and this is getting sort of getting away from the book, but not entirely. I mean, I think sooner than we expect, there's going to be a big target on the Great Lakes.
Yep, yep. And I do. It's not a big thing. Um, I set out to make this book eternally fun and optimistic, and so I don't deal with a lot of big issues. I'm more interested in, the hilarity ensues when good guys are trying to take down bad guys. That's a lot more interesting to me. But there is a mention of climate change, um, and it is present in the book. Reading it through the eyes of 2021, the fact is that lakes and rivers everywhere under stress. Whether it's from environmental considerations, global warming, pollution, whatever the case may be. So, but I don't, there are things like that. I steer away from a lot of things like that in the book that get people excited. So.
Sure. And I think readers of the book will appreciate that. I mean, there's
Yeah,
some
it's
if I
really
end up,
intended to be a fun and light and
yeah,
fast-paced read. It's not intended to get bogged down in uh, other things that we can argue about on Facebook.
exactly.
So,
Enough doom and gloom in other places. It's
yeah.
nice to have some something uplifting to turn to. Um, who are some of what are you reading now? Who are some authors that have inspired you in the past? Um, something makes me think you're fan of Edward Abbey and others. I don't know, maybe
I
not.
don't know. Edward Abbey was always kind of a little too dark and angry for me. I enjoy
Sure.
the idea that if you come across something in the desert that's man-made, you should destroy it immediately.
Mhm.
Uh, there's enough of anarchist in me that appreciates that.
Mhm.
Um, I've been going back to Hemingway. I'm reading anything, that talks about sort of the immigrant experience in
Mhm.
um, the country right now. There's a book called Favorite Son that I just finished. It's about a Filipino family, the Filipino experience being nothing I know anything about. Um, and so, uh, there's stuff like that. But I'm also, I go in cycles as a reader, um, where I get distracted by other things. So right now I'm working on a podcast project, and that's just talking to people across the country who do interesting things.
Mhm.
And that's, you know, part of what, you know, I use to sort of fill the creative batteries back up. So,
Have you released any of those? What's the name of it? Can you share anything
so
more
it's
about that?
it's the American Storyteller podcast. I had intended to release it right after the first of the year, but I've done a few episodes that are very timely. Um, One is an interview with a doctor in New Mexico, and his urgent care doctor. And so, what's going on with COVID right now is really important to understanding what doctors are facing. So, that episode might come out sooner, and I'll announce it on my Facebook page. And I have an American Storyteller page that it'll come out on. But that's, in between writing projects right now, that's sort of the thing that's going to keep me busy. So,
And that's just a fun way to stay creative, and it's
yeah,
a different kind of medium.
yeah.
And yeah, cool. Would you care to share another piece of the book, another passage or two? Anything else you had in mind that you thought about sharing from the book?
Um, yeah, again, sort of picking up on the theme, of um, small town life and kind of what's going on in rural America right now. There's one part that I wrote that always kind of sticks with me, and part of it is because um, I've been to a number of these places. Um, Frank is going to visit someone who, for the big part of the book, is an antagonist. Her name is Sarah, and he is just kind of looking around uh, at what he sees, and it's a big eye opener for him. Um, After two wrong turns and some backtracking, Frank glided to a stop in Sarah Gregory's driveway. He swung open the door and stepped out onto the gravel. Sarah Gregory had heard him drive in. She came out and stood at the top of her back steps. I figured you'd show up at some point, she said. Took a while to get out here, Frank said. You really are out here in the sticks, aren't you? Sarah put a hand on her hip. My boys live in fear of my wooden spoon, she said. The smallest is twice your size. Point well taken, Frank said. You got coffee all the way out here at least? We have running water and electricity too. Get your ass in here. I'll be right in, not moving too fast this morning. Take your time, Sarah said, and disappeared back through the screen door. Frank shuffled around the car. Everywhere he looked, something was in a state of neglect or disrepair. A rusty hulk of a stock car sat on blocks by the barn, a sickly sumac bush growing chaotically up through the empty engine compartment. At the front corner of the house, a fallow flower garden, ringed by crumbling concrete blocks, told a silent story of better times. As he ascended the rickety steps, he grabbed the wooden railing for support, but it simply wobbled away. He barely caught his balance before being pitched off.
Cool.
And I think that's like, you know, I don't know if you see it as much in the Midwest unless a farm is outright abandoned, but in the West anyway, that's a pretty typical scene of, someone sort of living a hard scrabble life, around the small towns. And I remember uh, these kids I played with uh, growing up, and they literally had a stock car on blocks in the yard with bushes growing up through it. So,
Yeah. Huh. And Sarah is a pretty strong character in the book.
mhm.
Was that a challenge for you as a male writer to kind of put yourself
Oh yeah,
in the
yeah,
head
yeah,
of
yeah,
a
absolutely. I
female?
think with this, and Sarah bears no relation to my wife, Sarah, by the way. I just want to, well, maybe a little bit, there's some snark in there. So, um, yeah, at one point, Frank calls her a regular Phyllis Diller, and she takes offense to the fact that Phyllis Diller is quite a bit older than her. And most people won't even know who Phyllis Diller is, but that's fine too. Um, so there, yeah, Sarah's a strong character. Um, I think the key with anytime you're writing directly outside of your own experience, you want to avoid certain tropes and um, certain caricatures that actually dehumanize the character in some ways, making it very one-dimensional. A character like Sarah could be, written as just, this kind of shrill um, malcontent. Um, and I felt really good that she showed a lot of growth in it. And then there's another character who comes along named Penelope Solace, and Penelope was a big surprise for me as a character. I wasn't, really expecting to write her into it. She's an FBI agent who, on top of Frank's all other troubles, the FBI is investigating him because he has an open file from the early '70s as a communist conspirator. So she comes along, and again, the challenge is to, I think, what I really want to do is write a female character and make her a complete character in her own right, not fall into this idea that, okay, well, because she's a female character, she's only complete if she has daddy issues, or she's only complete if she's looking to find that person to complete her, or something like that. I just wrote her straight up. She's competent. She's like one of the smartest people in the room at any given time. And so that for me as a writer was really gratifying. Um, and it was one of the things on the survey that I sent out to the beta readers too. I'm like, well, did you handle gender? Okay, and things like that, because um, appropriately, um, female characters have not been handled well in the past by male authors. So my hero, Hemingway being a perfect example.
Mhm.
So, and in fact, so I like Penelope so much that I think if there is any spin-off, what I'd like to call the Oxford universe, uh, it it'll be sort of around her, um, because she just turned out to be really neat.
Yeah.
The kind of person you'd want to have a beer with, and so.
When you say the kind of person who turned out to be neat, it kind of sounds like even though that was your intention, maybe it was also a little unexpected. Um, and what I mean by that, and I've heard this explained by other writers too, is that characters and plot can sometimes change and evolve and develop sort of on their own, unintentionally, but from the author. Maybe she was kind of just lurking and evolving in your subconscious or something like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into
No,
it.
I don't think you are at all. So, it was a surprise, I think, for me, kind of going back to previous writing and sort of thinking about female characters that I've done in the past. My previous characters, I wrote a whole character into my first book, Angel of Chaos, and went back and tried to, and she was just a victim, 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 victim. And I couldn't seem to break out of that cycle, you know. And I knew that, she was strong and could overcome. I just, and the plot just kept beating her down. And so, from again, my surprise is that I was able to get out of that mental cycle that I think a lot of popular culture puts female characters in. And the other surprise is that it was my intention to bring her in purely as a plot device for the conflict that arises and the uncomfortableness that arises around Frank Meade and his circumstances, because like on top of everything else now, the FBI is tailing him in a Ford LTD in a small town, with like one of those big spotlights on the side.
Right.
And so,
Yes.
so he has that to worry about on top of everything else.
Yeah.
And it turned out then I just kept sort of writing her into the dialogue, and then she became a much more interesting person than I had expected. And she went on her own arc,
Yeah.
And that arc, like I said, it may be something that I'm still sort of working out creatively, that maybe the follow-on to Frank Meade. We'll see.
Sure. But it also sounds like that's one of the ways that you have grown as a writer, from Angel of Chaos to Frank Meade. Are there other ways that you've grown as a writer? I mean, how are you a different writer now than you were for the first book?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I look upon long sentences with abhorrence at this stage. I mean, I know my writing, and the funny thing is that I'd written probably 10,000 words of Frank Meade 9 years ago, and that was the hardest part for me to go back and fix, because it was just so awful, the way I had constructed sentences, and trying to be clever, trying to use and stretch the meaning of words that are ridiculous to use to begin with. And so I know as a writer, especially in the last couple of years, I'm much more enamored with the short declarative sentence, descriptive words, not putting too much in. And honestly, I think that's why Frank Meade came out the length that it came out. I could have put, another 10 or 15,000 filler words in. But
it's lean.
I mean, yeah, it's lean,
you
and
cut away some of the
yeah,
cut away the excess. Yeah.
yeah. And honestly, another thing I've heard from readers is that they're thankful that the chapters are very short, because it makes it easier to read a whole chapter before you fall asleep at night.
Sure.
And so there's one chapter that's a page and a half. You can polish off a page and a half. Even I can do that. And I have maybe a good 5 minutes worth of reading before I fall asleep. So
yeah. So you have not started working on your next book yet, or I mean, maybe you are always working on the next book, a little piece at a time, or
yeah, I think the first time I say, yeah, I'm working on the next one, that'll be The Kiss of Death. It'll never happen. No, No, I'm taking a little break to work on the podcast. Um, I put a lot of a lot of myself into Frank Meade, and so at the risk of repeating myself or doing something that's unoriginal or contrived, I'm just going to let the creative batteries charge for a while.
Sure. Absolutely. So for those tuned in today, I did just in our chat post a link to a survey for our Central Wisconsin Book Festival. We'd love to hear your feedback on that. I haven't seen other questions from other folks, but Chris, for folks who are interested, how can
Well,
they?
I have to mention there are two people who, well, I guess you could say 3 or 4 people on who, anyone with the name Gerboth, first of all, they're not affiliated with me. So no, Laren Sharp, Robert, Kathleen, we all grew up around there. So
Yeah,
it's nice to, hopefully I got it sort of right. There's a lot of lore in it, but there's some of it that folks who grow up in a certain place and breathe the same air and
yeah.
experience some of the same things. So
I guess I hadn't thought about that, and probably lots of writers who choose to set all or parts of their books in areas where they grew up. If I did that, if I wrote, based my story on the small town in Michigan where I grew up, I would be really nervous by how it's perceived.
yeah, I
Nervous
was a
about
little
some of people's
nervous.
opinion. Yeah,
Yeah.
nervous,
So
but also I wouldn't care about some other people.
I care deeply. In fact,
Yeah,
I'm still in contact with a lot of people from where I grew up, and I
yeah,
belong to Facebook groups. And so every time somebody dies, I get a Facebook alert, and that happens all the time. Um,
yeah.
Apparently, there are packs of dogs running through Rocky Ford at this point that people complain about the packs of dogs.
Oh,
So, um, but
thanks.
um, so I do care, and everything. If I had written this book when I was younger, it would have been more cynical and probably a lot meaner. And everything that I have tried to do with this book is to turn that into optimism and honoring. I think the folks who still, hang in there despite overwhelming odds. And but I also had to make a couple phone calls. There's a character named Gary, and I had to call his older sister. Well, the person's older sister who was based on. And I said, I got this book coming out, and your brother was the inspiration for this character, and I just want you to know how much I loved him and
Hmm.
how much he meant to me. And so, and she's like, yeah, he was an interesting guy. So so people know, but I didn't want to put myself in a position of never being able to walk the streets there again, even though it may be ages before I ever go back. But I think it's important to, there's plenty of people to make fun of in the world, and most of them are not people who live in small towns.
Sure. I I would agree with that. Yeah. And Cheryl is watching asked, and we might know the answer to this, but did I ever get to the point where you considered writing under a pen name for a bit of anonymity?
No, not really, not really. I felt good enough about what I was doing, and Cheryl may feel differently. I don't know, but yeah. Um,
Gotcha.
I don't know how many people have read it from my hometown at this point, but there's been a few, and
Yeah.
I haven't got any death threats. So
That's good. I think Cheryl is, if it's the same Cheryl I'm thinking of, is one of our committee members. So she's
oh,
not
okay, all
one
right,
time. So.
good. Well, I don't have to avoid Cheryl then.
Gotcha. James noted, folks at Red Door Family Farm suggested we meet. So hello. And could you please say a bit more about how you worked with or made use of your critical readers? You mentioned that you sent out surveys,
Hmm.
but just, um, did you find yourself incorporating and making changes based on their comments, or was it just to kind of
It
confirm
was a
what you already knew?
continuum. Yeah, there were some readers who just gave it a quick read and did the survey. There were a few who reached out to me and said, I think here's some feedback for you, and so it ran the gamut.
Okay.
Um, but again, I strongly recommend it. And
Yeah.
Red Door Family Farm, by the way, I can't say enough about them. They're wonderful, wonderful people. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I wasn't familiar with that concept of beta readers. So
yeah, yeah, highly recommend it.
where did you hear about it? Have you been someone else's beta reader?
No, I made it up.
Oh,
Um,
all right. That's cool.
and then afterwards, I looked, and apparently there's been some other sort of indie authors that have done it.
Cool.
Um, and I guess there's etiquette. You have to give a little gift, so I sent everybody, $10 Amazon gift cards. Conveniently
So,
could be used to buy my book. So
and I think you said you had to recruit some. Did you know all of your beta readers or?
yeah, mostly. I sent out a appeal on Facebook, and so some of them I knew really well, some I didn't know very well at all,
Mhm.
and they ran age gamut.
Good.
And interesting, like one of the readers is 21 or 22 years old, and the
Mhm.
whole idea of a character um, struggling with the idea of coming out as a gay man, he was kind of like, what's the big deal? I don't get it. It's like, and so that's one of the interesting things too. And you look at generational things, and this book is very much set in a certain generation, and when that was a big deal, and younger people now it's not. So
Sure. And I was actually kind of thinking about that when you were talking about the character of Sarah. And sometimes, and I know I'm certainly guilty of this, where we get into almost eggshell territory where um, you become so concerned about saying or writing the wrong things, portraying people in a way they don't want to be portrayed, when sometimes it would be so much better to just step back and just say forget it. It's a person. They're just, you don't have to dance
but,
around things.
but
Just
people are complicated, and I think
sure.
the worst thing a writer, in a lot of ways, the worst thing a writer can do is write out of fear that they are going to say or do the wrong thing. I mean, you can always edit the wrong thing out. You can always get feedback from other people saying, this is bullshit. You need to fix this. Or you know, where have you been dragging your knuckles lately? You really need to work on that. And that's what I have my Sarah for, to to a large extent. But
Yeah.
I think if you write to authenticity, and you present the character in the fullest sense of who they are, that even if you are encroaching upon territory that might be considered uncomfortable,
Mhm.
that and you do it in a way that's respectful and treats the character like a person,
Mhm.
then I don't think you can go wrong.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good positive note to, I think,
Yeah.
perhaps end things on. So the book is Frank Meade. For those of you watching who are in central Wisconsin area, you can find it at Janke Bookstore. Maybe like beyond, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the one in Stevens Point, but it's within the store process in Stevens Point. And then, or anywhere books are sold, ideally independent sellers.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. Anybody
Chris,
can order it. Any bookstore can order it, and I prefer you do go to a bookstore to get it ordered. Of course, Amazon boxes come to my house all the time. So
likewise, likewise. And is Facebook your main mode of communicating with folks?
at American Storyteller, yeah, at American Storyteller, or facebook.com/American Storyteller, and that's where I present my writing projects and also the podcast.
Great, great. Well, Chris Gerboth, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. Great to see your faces.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, great to see your faces. Thank you for joining, Chris. Thank you for joining us during the Central Wisconsin Book Festival. And so ends the 5th annual Central Wisconsin Book Festival. And once again, we're very
out with a bang.
Yes, yeah. Very glad we could end it with a Central Wisconsin author once again. So thanks, Chris. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye now.